The rain fell in torrents against the grimy windows of the shabby boarding-house, each drop seeming to echo the despair that had settled deep within Lady Evangeline Harrington's heart. She pressed her pale cheek against the cold glass, watching the fashionable carriages roll past through the puddle-strewn streets of London, their occupants warm and dry and utterly oblivious to her plight. How different her life had been merely 6 months ago! Then, she had been the toast of London society, the eldest daughter of the Earl of Whitmore, sought after by every eligible bachelor in the ton. Her dance-card had always been full, her drawing-room crowded with suitors, her future seemingly as bright as the diamonds that had once adorned her throat. But that was before she had dared to defy convention, before she had refused to marry Lord Pemberton, the man her father had chosen for her, a man 3 times her age with wandering hands and breath that reeked of spirits and decay. When she had stood firm in her refusal, declaring that she would rather die than submit to such a union, her world had crumbled around her like a house of cards. Her father had been apoplectic with rage. "You ungrateful, willful child!" he had thundered, his face purple with fury. "Lord Pemberton is offering a generous settlement, one that will clear our debts and restore our family's standing. You will marry him, or you will be no daughter of mine." But Evangeline had held fast to her convictions, even when her mother had pleaded with tears streaming down her cheeks, even when her younger siblings had been forbidden from speaking to her. She had endured weeks of cold shoulders and cutting remarks, watched as former friends crossed the street to avoid her, felt the weight of society's disapproval settle upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The final blow had come when her father had made good on his threat. She had been cast out from Whitmore House with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small purse containing barely enough coins to secure lodgings for a month. Her title meant nothing now. She was merely another fallen woman, a cautionary tale whispered about in fashionable drawing-rooms. Now, as autumn gave way to winter, that small purse was nearly empty. The modest room she rented in Mrs. Pembroke's boarding-house was due to be vacated within the week, and she had no prospects, no hope of employment that would not further tarnish her already ruined reputation. Ladies of quality were not expected to work, and even if they were, what skills did she possess beyond watercolors and French conversation? A sharp knock at her door interrupted her melancholy reverie. "Miss Harrington," came Mrs. Pembroke's shrill voice through the thin wood. "There's a gentleman here to see you." Evangeline's heart leaped with desperate hope. Perhaps her father had relented. Perhaps one of her brothers had defied his edict and come to offer assistance. She smoothed her worn dress, once a fashionable creation of emerald silk, now faded and mended in several places, and hurried to the narrow staircase. But the man waiting in Mrs. Pembroke's cramped parlor was not her father or either of her brothers. He was a stranger, tall and impeccably dressed in a coat of midnight blue superfine, his dark hair gleaming despite the dreary weather. His face was aristocratic in its angles, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw, but there was something cold and forbidding in his pale grey eyes as they swept over her with obvious assessment. "Lady Evangeline," he said, inclining his head in the barest suggestion of a bow. His voice was cultured, refined, but held an edge that made her shiver. "I am the Duke of Ravenshollow. Perhaps you have heard of me." Indeed she had. Adrian Blackthorne, the Duke of Ravenshollow, was notorious throughout London society. Wealthy beyond measure, possessed of ancient bloodlines and vast estates, he was also known for his ruthless business dealings and icy demeanor. It was said that he had never been seen to smile, that he collected beautiful things only to grow bored with them and cast them aside. Women threw themselves at his feet despite, or perhaps because of, his reputation for coldness, but he had never shown interest in any of them. "Your Grace," Evangeline managed, offering a curtsy that was perhaps not as deep as protocol demanded but was all her pride would allow. "I confess myself surprised by your visit. We have not been introduced." A ghost of something that might have been amusement flickered across his severe features. "No, we have not. But your situation has come to my attention." Heat flooded her cheeks at the delicate emphasis he placed on that word. Of course. Even the great Duke of Ravenshollow had heard of her disgrace. She lifted her chin, preparing herself for whatever fresh humiliation he had come to deliver. "I have a proposition for you," he continued, his grey eyes never leaving her face. "One that could prove mutually beneficial." "I cannot imagine what benefit I could possibly offer you, your Grace," she replied, her voice cooler than she felt. "As you have so kindly observed, my situation is rather reduced." "On the contrary," he said, moving closer with predatory grace. Even in her diminished circumstances, she could not help but notice how perfectly his clothes fit his lean frame, how his mere presence seemed to fill the shabby room with an energy that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "You offer something quite valuable indeed. And what might that be?" "Your breeding, your bloodline, your ability to move through the highest circles of society, or at least you could once again, with the proper sponsorship." Evangeline felt her stomach plummet. "You wish me to become your mistress," she said flatly. To her surprise, he laughed, a sound so rich and unexpected that it sent an unwelcome thrill through her. "My dear girl, I have no shortage of women willing to warm my bed. If that were all I wanted, I would hardly have sought out a penniless outcast with a reputation for stubborn defiance." The words stung, but she refused to let him see how deeply. "Then what do you want?" "A wife." The simple declaration hung in the air between them like a challenge. Evangeline stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me correctly. I find myself in need of a duchess, and you find yourself in need of salvation. It seems a practical arrangement." But you don't even know me," she stammered, her composure finally cracking. "We have exchanged perhaps 50 words, and you propose marriage?" "I know enough," he said with that same cold precision. "I know that you have been disinherited for refusing to marry against your inclinations, which suggests a strength of character that could prove useful. I know that you are well-born enough to fulfill the social requirements of my position. And I know that you are desperate enough to consider even this unconventional offer." His brutal honesty was like a slap, but she could not deny its accuracy. Still, she struggled to comprehend his motives. "Why?" she whispered. "You could have any woman in England. Why choose me?" For the first time since he had entered the room, something flickered in his eyes, something dark and complex that she could not quite read. "Because, Lady Evangeline, you are the only woman in England who has proven herself capable of choosing ruin over a marriage that repulses her. That particular form of courage is exactly what I require." "I don't understand." "You will." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope sealed with his ducal crest. "These are the terms of my offer. You will find them generous, more than generous. A settlement that will restore your family's debts, an allowance for your personal use that will far exceed anything you knew even in your father's house, and the protection of my name and position." "And in return?" "In return, you will become my duchess. You will bear my heirs, manage my households, and fulfill the social obligations that come with the position. Nothing more, nothing less." The clinical way he spoke of marriage, as if it were merely another business transaction, should have appalled her. Instead, she found herself oddly grateful for his honesty. There would be no pretense of affection, no false promises of love that could later be broken. "I require time to consider your offer," she said carefully. "You have until tomorrow evening," he replied without hesitation. "After that, the offer expires, and you may resume your descent into poverty and obscurity." The cruelty of the statement took her breath away, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw no malice there, only a calm acknowledgment of facts. It was, perhaps, the most terrifying thing about him. "Very well," she managed. "Tomorrow evening." He inclined his head and moved toward the door, then paused. Lady Evangeline? Do not let misguided romantic notions cloud your judgment. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. But I give you my word that as my Duchess, you will want for nothing, and you will be treated with the respect due your position." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of sandalwood and the sound of his carriage wheels on the cobblestones outside. Evangeline sank into Mrs. Pembroke's worn armchair, her legs suddenly unsteady, and stared at the sealed envelope in her trembling hands. That night she read the terms of his proposal by candlelight, her eyes widening with each line. The Duke of Ravenshollow was not exaggerating when he claimed to be generous. The settlement he offered would not only clear her family's debts, but would establish a trust that would ensure their comfort for generations. Her personal allowance was staggering in its magnitude. Most shocking of all was a clause stating that should he predecease her, she would inherit not only his London properties but a substantial portion of his liquid assets. It was the kind of offer that no rational woman in her position could refuse, and yet she found herself strangely reluctant to accept. There had been something in his manner, something in the careful way he had avoided certain subjects, that suggested this arrangement was far more complex than he had indicated. But what choice did she have? In less than a week she would be turned out onto the streets with nothing. No family would take her in, no respectable employment would be offered to a woman of her notorious reputation. This marriage, cold and calculated though it might be, represented her only hope of survival. The next evening she waited in Mrs. Pembroke's parlor wearing the one decent dress she still owned, her decision made. When the Duke arrived, precisely on time, as she somehow knew he would be, she was ready for him. "Your Grace," she said, rising to meet him, "I accept your proposal." If he felt any satisfaction at her capitulation, it did not show on his face. "Excellent. The banns will be posted tomorrow. We shall be married by special license in 3 days' time." "So quickly? I see no purpose in delay. You will remove to my London residence tomorrow afternoon. My housekeeper will see to your needs until the wedding." The speed with which he moved forward left her breathless, but she supposed it was for the best. The longer she had to think about what she was doing, the more likely she was to lose her nerve. 3 days later she stood in the private chapel of Ravenshollow House, wearing a gown of cream silk that the Duke had somehow procured in her exact measurements, and spoke the vows that would bind her to a man she barely knew. He looked magnificent in his wedding attire, every inch the powerful Duke, but his grey eyes remained as cold and unreadable as ever. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, witnessed only by the required number of servants. There was no kiss to seal their union, only a formal handshake and a curt nod from her new husband. She was now the Duchess of Ravenshollow, one of the most powerful women in England, and she had never felt more alone. That evening she dined alone in the grand dining-room of her new home, served by silent, efficient servants on plates of finest china. The Duke, she was informed by the butler, was away on business and would return in several days. She was shown to the Duchess's apartments, a suite of rooms so luxurious they took her breath away, and left to contemplate her new life in solitude. Over the following weeks she began to understand the strange nature of her marriage. The Duke was often away, and when he was in residence he treated her with unfailing courtesy but maintained a distance that felt as vast as an ocean. They took meals together when his schedule permitted, discussed household matters with businesslike efficiency, and attended the necessary social functions as a united front. To the outside world they appeared to be a perfectly matched couple. He was attentive without being demonstrative, she was gracious without being effusive, and their combined presence commanded respect wherever they went. Society, which had so recently shunned her, now courted her favor with shameless desperation. But in private they remained strangers. He had his wing of the house, she had hers, and never the twain did meet. He treated her as he might treat a business partner, with respect and consideration, but without warmth or intimacy. She began to wonder if he intended their marriage to remain unconsummated indefinitely. The question was answered one night in early spring, nearly 3 months after their wedding. She had retired to her chamber and was brushing her hair before the mirror when she heard the connecting door between their rooms open. She turned, startled, to find the Duke standing in the doorway, still dressed in his evening clothes, but with his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly dishevelled. "Your Grace," she breathed, her heart suddenly racing. "I didn't expect—" "I should have sent word," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "But I find myself in need of an heir." The blunt statement should have offended her, but instead she found herself oddly thrilled by the barely controlled tension she could sense beneath his calm exterior. For the first time since their marriage, he looked at her not as a business associate but as a woman, and the heat in his pale eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "I see," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He moved closer, and she could smell the brandy on his breath, could see the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly at his sides. "If you are not amenable—" "I am your wife," she said simply, setting down her brush and rising to face him. "In all ways." Something flashed in his eyes at her words, gratitude, perhaps, or relief. He approached her slowly, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt if startled, and when his hands finally touched her shoulders, they were surprisingly gentle. "I will try not to hurt you," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. But he did hurt her, though not in the way he meant. His touch was skilled and careful, his body magnificent in its masculine power, and he brought her to heights of pleasure she had never dreamed possible. The pain came from the careful distance he maintained even in their most intimate moments, the way he seemed to hold himself apart from her even as their bodies joined in the most fundamental way. Afterward, as she lay trembling in the aftermath of sensations that had shattered her very conception of herself, he withdrew to his own chamber without a word. She pressed her face into the pillows and wept, though she could not have said whether her tears were from joy or sorrow. This pattern continued for months. He would come to her chamber perhaps once or twice a week, always courteous, always considerate of her pleasure, but always maintaining that invisible barrier between them. She began to live for those visits, to find herself watching for signs that he might come to her that night, and she despised herself for the weakness even as she could not deny it. The household staff began to look at her with something approaching pity when her monthly courses continued to arrive with clockwork regularity. She knew they whispered about the Duchess who could not seem to perform her most basic duty, and the shame of it ate at her like acid. It was on a particularly dark October evening, nearly a year after their marriage, that everything changed. She had been feeling unwell for several days, a persistent queasiness that she attributed to a change in the weather, when her lady's maid made an observation that stopped her cold. "Your Grace," Martha said hesitantly as she helped Evangeline prepare for bed, "forgive me for speaking out of turn, but when did you last have your monthly courses?" The question sent a shock of realization through her. She had been so miserable, so focused on what was lacking in her marriage, that she had failed to notice the absence of something she had come to dread. Quick calculation confirmed what Martha suspected. She was nearly 6 weeks late. "Send for Dr. Morrison," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "At once." The physician's examination confirmed what she had hardly dared to hope. She was indeed with child, likely conceived during one of her husband's rare visits to her chamber. The news filled her with a joy so fierce it took her breath away, followed immediately by a terror equally intense. How would the Duke react? Would he be pleased that she had finally fulfilled her primary function, or would the prospect of an heir make him even more distant? She found herself unable to predict his response, and that uncertainty kept her awake long into the night. She decided to tell him the next evening, after dinner, when they were taking tea in the drawing-room in their customary silence. But as she opened her mouth to speak, he forestalled her with words that made her blood run cold. "I have been thinking, Evangeline," he said without looking up from his newspaper, "that perhaps it would be best if we established separate households. You could take the estate in Yorkshire. It's quite lovely, and the air would be good for your health." The casual way he spoke of banishing her, for that was what it amounted to, hit her like a physical blow. I don't understand. Have I displeased you in some way?" For the first time, he looked directly at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart stutter. Pain, deep and raw and quickly hidden, but unmistakable. "On the contrary, you have been everything I could have asked for in a duchess. But I think it would be better for both of us if we maintained a more conventional distance." "Adrian," she said, using his given name for the first time since their wedding, and saw him flinch as if she had struck him. "Please, help me understand." He set down his newspaper with hands that were not quite steady. "You ask too much of me, Evangeline. Your very presence in this house is a torment I can no longer endure." The confession was torn from him as if against his will, and she stared at him in shock. "A torment? But why?" He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Because you are everything I never dared to want, and I am not fool enough to believe that what we have could ever be more than a business arrangement. You married me for security, for position, for survival. I understand that, and I accepted it. But I find I am not as strong as I believed myself to be." The pain in his voice made her own heart ache. "Adrian." "No." He held up a hand to silence her. "Do not offer me platitudes or false comfort. I know what I am, Evangeline. I know what this marriage is. And I know that the longer we continue this charade of domesticity, the more likely I am to make a fool of myself by forgetting the terms of our agreement." She stared at him in wonder, finally understanding the careful distance he had maintained, the way he held himself apart even in their most intimate moments. He was protecting himself, protecting them both, from something he believed could only end in disappointment and pain. "You are such a fool," she whispered, and saw him recoil as if she had slapped him. "Perhaps. But I am a fool with enough sense to—" "I'm carrying your child," she interrupted, the words tumbling out in a rush. The effect on him was immediate and devastating. All the color drained from his face, and for a moment she thought he might collapse. He gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "What did you say?" "I'm with child," she repeated more gently. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it this morning. About 6 weeks along, he believes." Adrian stared at her for a long moment, a dozen emotions chasing across his features too quickly for her to interpret. Then, without warning, he buried his face in his hands and began to laugh, great shaking laughs that sounded suspiciously like sobs. "Adrian!" She rose from her chair and approached him cautiously. Are you not pleased?" He looked up at her with eyes bright with unshed tears and something that might have been wonder. "Pleased?" he repeated hoarsely. "My dear girl, I am terrified. But surely this is what you wanted? An heir." "An heir, yes," he said, rising to stand before her. "But not this. Not the impossible dream that perhaps, some day, you might come to care for me as more than just the man who rescued you from destitution." His admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable and completely at odds with the cold, controlled man she thought she knew. She reached up to touch his face, and he closed his eyes at the gentle contact as if it caused him physical pain. "You really are the most magnificent fool," she murmured, and felt him tense beneath her touch. "Do you truly believe I could have shared your bed all these months, could have welcomed you into my body, if I felt nothing for you?" His eyes snapped open. "But you said, when I proposed, you said nothing of affection." "Because you made it abundantly clear that affection was not part of our bargain," she replied. "You were so determined to keep this arrangement purely business that I dared not hope for anything more. But, Adrian, surely you must have noticed that I never turned you away?" that I looked forward to your visits to my chamber with a longing that had nothing to do with duty?" He searched her face as if looking for signs of deception. You care for me?" "Care for you." She laughed, the sound bright and clear in the quiet room. "My dear husband, I have been hopelessly, desperately in love with you for months. I thought you were going to send me away because you had grown tired of me, not because you were afraid of caring too much." The confession seemed to stun him into silence. He stood perfectly still, his gray eyes wide with disbelief, and she could see him struggling to process what she had just revealed. "You love me," he said finally, as if testing the words. "Completely, utterly, against all reason and propriety." She smiled through the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I fell in love with your intelligence, your strength, your careful consideration of my comfort even when you believed I was merely tolerating your touch. I fell in love with the way you speak to your servants with respect, the way you manage your estates with such dedication to your tenants' welfare. I fell in love with a man who married a disgraced outcast not out of pity but because he saw strength in her defiance." "Evangeline," he breathed, her name falling from his lips like a prayer. "I love you, Adrian Blackthorne," she said firmly. "And I will continue to love you whether you send me to Yorkshire or keep me here, whether you believe in that love or dismiss it as impossible. But please, I beg you, don't send me away from you. Don't condemn our child to grow up believing their father could not bear to be in the same house with their mother." For answer, he pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of months of careful restraint finally shattered. His mouth found hers in a kiss that was nothing like the controlled, passionless embraces he had given her before. This kiss was hungry and demanding and full of all the emotion he had been so carefully suppressing. "I love you," he said against her lips, the words falling like rain after a long drought. "God help me, Evangeline. I have loved you since the day I found you in that wretched boarding-house, looking so proud and beautiful and utterly unbroken despite everything they had done to you. I have loved you through every cold, careful conversation, every night I forced myself to leave your chamber when all I wanted was to hold you until dawn. I have loved you so completely it frightened me, because I could not bear the thought of losing you if you ever realized you could do better than a cold, calculating devil like me." "Never," she whispered fiercely. "You are not cold or calculating. You are careful and protective and so much stronger than you know. You saved me, Adrian, not just from poverty or disgrace, but from a life without love, without passion, without the possibility of joy." He kissed her again, deeper this time, pouring all his careful control into the fire of finally acknowledged love. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air around them seemed to crackle with the energy of barriers finally broken down. "Our child," he said wonderingly, his hand moving to rest gently on her stomach. "Our child will be born of love, not just duty." "The greatest love I have ever known," she confirmed, covering his hand with her own. That night, when he came to her chamber, it was not as the Duke of Ravenshollow fulfilling his obligation to secure an heir, but as Adrian, her husband, her love, claiming the woman who held his heart. Their joining was tender and passionate and full of all the words they had been afraid to speak, and afterward they lay entwined in the darkness, finally whole. The months that followed were the happiest of Evangeline's life. Gone was the careful distance that had characterized their marriage, replaced by a warmth and intimacy that transformed Ravenshollow House from a grand but cold mansion into a true home. Adrian was attentive and loving throughout her pregnancy, often talking to their unborn child and reading aloud from his favorite books while his hand rested on her growing belly. When their son was born on a bright spring morning, Adrian wept openly as he held the tiny, perfect child they had created together. Little Charles Adrian Blackthorne was, in his father's unbiased opinion, the most beautiful baby ever born, and in his mother's equally unbiased view, the most intelligent. But perhaps the most beautiful moment came 6 months later, when Evangeline's father arrived at Ravenshollow House, hat in hand and pride swallowed, to request an audience with his daughter. She received him in the grand drawing-room, dressed in a gown of sapphire silk that complemented the magnificent sapphire necklace Adrian had given her for their first wedding anniversary, her son sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Evangeline," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "My dear girl, can you ever forgive a stubborn old fool?" She looked at this man who had cast her out for refusing to sacrifice her principles, who had chosen money and social standing over his daughter's happiness, and found that the bitter anger she had carried for so long had transformed into something softer. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of peaceful indifference. "I am the Duchess of Ravenshollow now, Papa," she said quietly. "I have a husband who loves me and a son who will inherit one of the greatest titles in England. What is there to forgive?" Her father flinched at the gentle rebuke. "I was wrong. About Pemberton, about your defiance, about what was best for you. I should have trusted your judgment, should have protected you instead of casting me out to starve," she finished calmly. "Yes, you should have." "I thought I was doing what was best for the family," he said weakly. "You were doing what was easiest for you." Adrian's voice came from the doorway, cool and controlled. He moved to stand behind Evangeline's chair, one hand resting possessively on her shoulder. "But I confess I am grateful for your short-sightedness, Lord Whitmore. Had you been a better father, I might never have had the opportunity to marry your remarkable daughter." The Earl of Whitmore looked up at the Duke of Ravenshollow, one of the most powerful men in England, and had the grace to look ashamed. "Your Grace, I hope we might." "You hope we might what?" Adrian asked with deceptive mildness. "Welcome you back into our family? Pretend that you did not abandon your daughter in her hour of greatest need? Forget that you chose a drunken lecher's money over your own child's welfare?" "Adrian," Evangeline said softly, and he immediately gentled. "You are my wife's father," he continued, his voice still cold but less cutting. "For her sake, you will always be welcome in this house. But do not mistake courtesy for forgiveness. You lost the right to my wife's love when you threw her away like refuse. If you wish to earn even a portion of it back, you will have to prove yourself worthy of the extraordinary woman you were fool enough to discard." The Earl nodded, chastened, and took his leave soon after with promises to do better, to be the father and grandfather Evangeline and her son deserved. Whether he would make good on those promises remained to be seen, but Evangeline found she no longer cared as much as she once might have. Her real family was here, in this house, with the man who had seen her value when no one else would, and the child who had been born of their perfect love. That evening, as they sat together in their private sitting-room, Adrian reading correspondence while Evangeline worked on embroidery for the nursery, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean. You could have had your pick of any woman in England." Adrian looked up from his letters, his grey eyes warm with the love he no longer bothered to hide. "My darling girl, I had my pick of any woman in England, and I chose you. The only woman brave enough to choose ruin over a repugnant marriage, the only woman strong enough to match me, the only woman capable of bringing light into my carefully ordered darkness." He set aside his work and moved to kneel beside her chair. "You are my salvation, Evangeline. You saved me from a life of cold calculation and empty success. You gave me love, gave me a family, gave me a reason to be something more than just the Duke of Ravenshollow." She set down her embroidery to frame his face with her hands, still sometimes amazed by her freedom to touch him, to show him her love openly. "And you saved me from a life of loneliness and regret. You saw something in me worth preserving when everyone else saw only a scandalous failure." "I saw a woman who valued her principles more than her comfort," he replied, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "I saw courage and strength and a beauty that had nothing to do with mere physical appearance. I saw the woman I had been waiting for my entire life without even knowing it." Their son chose that moment to wake from his nap, his lusty cries echoing through the house, and they both laughed as they rose to answer his summons. As they stood over the cradle, watching their perfect child stretch and yawn, Adrian's arm around her waist, Evangeline thought of all the women who had thrown themselves at her husband over the years, never understanding that what he needed was not adoration but partnership, not submission but strength. She had been cast out, abandoned, left to face the world alone because she had dared to choose love over duty, principle over pragmatism. But in the end, that choice had led her to a love beyond her wildest dreams, to a man who valued her strength rather than demanding her surrender, to a happiness she had never dared to hope for. The rain still fell sometimes against the windows of Ravenshollow House, but now she listened to it from rooms filled with warmth and love, secure in the knowledge that she was cherished beyond measure. She had found her salvation in the most unlikely place, in the arms of a man who had needed saving as much as she did, and who had found in their love the courage to open his carefully guarded heart. Their story would become legend in the ton, the disgraced lady and the cold duke who found in each other the perfect match. But they knew the truth was far more beautiful than any story society might tell. They had found in each other not just love, but redemption, not just passion, but peace, not just a marriage, but a true partnership that would endure for all their days. And when their grandchildren would ask, years later, how their love story began, Evangeline would smile and tell them that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest disasters, and that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source of all, a heart brave enough to risk everything for love.